The atmosphere inside the martial arts convention hall was energetic but respectful. Fighters, trainers, and fans from different disciplines had gathered to celebrate martial arts culture, exchange knowledge, and meet some of the legends they had admired for years. Conversations about techniques, tournaments, and training experiences filled the air. Among the guests arriving quietly was Steven Seagal. Unlike many celebrities who entered with security or loud introductions, Seagal walked in calmly, greeting a few familiar faces with a nod and a handshake. He seemed relaxed, blending into the environment rather than trying to stand out. Not far from the entrance, another legend of combat sports, Joe Louis, was already deep in conversation with a group of fighters. Known for his competitive spirit and outspoken personality, Louis noticed Seagal entering the hall. At first, his comments seemed playful, but soon his tone shifted. "Here comes the movie master," Louis said loudly enough for others nearby to hear. A few people chuckled, unsure if he was joking or being serious. As Seagal approached, Louis continued, making sarcastic remarks about Aikido and questioning how effective it would be in real combat situations. People nearby began paying attention. Some smiled awkwardly, others sensed tension forming. Chuck Norris, who was also present at the event, stood nearby greeting fans but occasionally glanced toward the growing scene. Seagal, however, didn't react. He greeted a few attendees politely and continued walking, seemingly uninterested in confrontation. His calm demeanor surprised some people, while others wondered if he had simply ignored the comments. Moments like these often happen when strong personalities share the same space. Sometimes it's friendly rivalry, but other times ego and pride push situations toward conflict. And when legends stand face to face, everyone expects something dramatic to happen. Soon, more people gathered, sensing something unusual might unfold. A few attendees even lifted their phones, anticipating that something memorable could occur. Joe Louis, noticing the growing attention, seemed encouraged to continue, raising his voice slightly as he questioned whether Seagal would ever prove himself outside movie sets. The room slowly grew quieter as people waited for a response. And just when everyone expected Steven Seagal to react emotionally, what he did next shocked everyone watching. The tension in the hall didn't disappear after the first remarks. In fact, it slowly grew stronger. People who had been chatting casually moments earlier now found their attention drifting toward the small crowd forming around Steven Seagal and Joe Louis. Joe Louis, clearly enjoying the attention, stepped a little closer to Seagal, his voice now loud enough for almost everyone nearby to hear. "So tell me," Louis said with a smirk, "does that movie-style fighting actually work when someone hits back for real?" A few people laughed nervously. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Everyone present respected both men in different ways, and watching two legends clash felt strange. Seagal turned slightly toward Louis, his expression calm and unreadable. Instead of reacting with anger, he simply gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the comment without accepting the challenge behind it. "I'm just here to enjoy the event," Seagal replied quietly. His voice was steady, almost gentle. No need for drama. But Louis wasn't ready to drop the issue. Years of competition had built his reputation on dominance and proving strength, and the growing crowd seemed to fuel his confidence. "No drama," Louis replied, raising his eyebrows. "Come on, people want to see what really works." More attendees started gathering, sensing confrontation. Some pulled out their phones, recording discreetly. In today's world, moments like these quickly become viral, and everyone knew this situation had the potential to explode. Chuck Norris, still greeting fans nearby, noticed the shift in atmosphere. He looked over more frequently now, his expression thoughtful. He didn't interfere, but it was clear he was watching carefully. Seagal, however, remained composed. He crossed his arms calmly and looked around at the growing crowd rather than directly at Louis. It was almost as if he was more concerned about the atmosphere in the room than the challenge itself. Situations like this happen often in competitive environments. Sometimes, people feel the need to prove themselves publicly, especially when legends are involved. Pride, reputation, and ego can quickly turn small comments into major confrontations. But true discipline often shows itself in restraint rather than aggression. Louis shook his head, clearly unsatisfied with Seagal's calm reaction. "Or maybe," Louis added, "you just don't want to be tested." A few people gasped softly. The comment was sharper now, clearly meant to provoke. Seagal simply smiled faintly. There was no anger, no visible frustration, just patience. The crowd felt torn. Some wanted Seagal to respond and defend himself. Others admired how calmly he handled the pressure. At moments like these, people often reveal their true character. Some react emotionally. Others choose silence and control. Before we continue, tell us something. Which country and city are you watching this story from? Stories like this reach people all around the world, and it's always fascinating to see how different cultures view respect and confrontation. Meanwhile, inside the hall, the tension continued to build. The cameras were still recording. Fighters whispered among themselves. Everyone sensed that something bigger was about to happen. Joe Louis waited, expecting Seagal to finally react. But no one in that room could have predicted how Steven Seagal would handle what came next. By now, the energy inside the hall had completely shifted. What had started as casual conversation and friendly interaction at the martial arts gathering had turned into a tense circle of spectators surrounding two legendary figures. Word spread quickly across the venue that something serious was happening. More attendees moved closer, forming a loose crowd around Steven Seagal and Joe Louis. Conversations stopped, and the usual laughter and excitement faded into whispers and quiet anticipation. Joe Louis stood confidently, clearly comfortable in confrontational situations. Years of competitive fighting had shaped him into someone who never backed down from a challenge, especially in public. Seagal, on the other hand, seemed almost unaffected by the pressure. His posture remained relaxed, his breathing steady. He didn't step forward or backward. He simply stood there, calm amid rising tension. Louis crossed his arms and spoke again, this time more directly. "So what is it, Steven?" he asked. "You going to show us something, or just keep pretending this is beneath you?" The crowd reacted with murmurs. Some people shifted nervously, sensing things might escalate. A few of Seagal's acquaintances stepped closer to him, quietly suggesting he ignore the situation and move away. One trainer leaned toward him and whispered, "It's not worth it. People are just looking for drama." Situations like this often become bigger than the people involved. Once a crowd gathers, emotions rise quickly. People expect conflict, and sometimes pressure alone forces reactions that wouldn't normally happen. But Seagal still didn't react emotionally. Chuck Norris, now clearly paying attention, moved slightly closer. He wasn't interfering, but his presence alone added weight to the moment. Many in the crowd noticed him watching carefully, which made the situation feel even more significant. Joe Louis noticed the growing attention as well. Instead of backing down, he seemed encouraged by it. "You know," Louis continued, his voice firm, "real fighters step up when challenged. That's what respect is built on." The words hung in the air. Several attendees nodded, while others looked uneasy. Respect in martial arts means different things to different people. For some, it's about winning fights. For others, it's about discipline and control. Seagal looked around the room slowly, almost studying the crowd rather than his challenger. His expression remained calm, but those close enough to see his face noticed something had shifted slightly, not anger, but focus. The tension was now thick enough that even casual spectators felt it. Moments like these often define how people are remembered. One emotional reaction can overshadow years of discipline and achievements. Everyone present seemed to realize they were witnessing a moment that could become legendary. A few more phones rose into the air as people continued recording. Social media had trained everyone to capture drama instantly. Joe Louis took another step forward, closing the distance slightly. "So what's it going to be?" he asked. "Walk away, or prove something?" The crowd collectively held its breath. Before we see what Seagal does next, think about this situation for a moment. If you were standing in his place, surrounded by people, cameras recording, and someone challenging your reputation in public, would you walk away to avoid conflict, or would you stand your ground calmly? Tell us your opinion in the comments. Because situations like this don't just test fighting skills, they test character. Seagal finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected. He slowly uncrossed his arms and adjusted his stance, not aggressively, but with quiet confidence. The small movement alone caused murmurs among spectators, who sensed a shift in the moment. Chuck Norris watched closely now, his expression serious. Even experienced fighters nearby leaned forward slightly, curious about what would happen next. But instead of stepping toward Lewis or preparing to fight, Seagal did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not an angry one. Just a calm, almost understanding smile. The crowd seemed confused. Lewis frowned slightly, clearly unsure how to interpret the reaction. And in that quiet pause, everyone sensed the confrontation had reached a turning point. What Steven Seagal would say or do next would completely change the situation, and no one in that hall was ready for it. The silence following Steven Seagal's calm smile felt heavier than the earlier confrontation. For several seconds, no one spoke. The crowd, expecting aggression or at least a sharp comeback, instead found themselves watching a moment of stillness. Joe Louis looked slightly confused. He had expected resistance, maybe even anger, something he could respond to. Instead, Seagal's calm reaction seemed to pull the energy out of the confrontation rather than fuel it. People in the crowd began whispering among themselves. "Does Lewis know who he's really talking to?" someone murmured. Another voice quietly added, "Seagal's trained for decades. This might not go the way Lewis thinks." Word spread through the spectators as more people recalled Seagal's long martial arts background. Some younger attendees only knew him as an action movie star, but older fighters and trainers present understood that his experience extended far beyond film sets. Chuck Norris, still observing from nearby, crossed his arms and stepped closer to the circle forming around the two men. His calm presence alone caused more people to fall silent. Many in the room respected Norris as much as Lewis and Seagal, and seeing him pay serious attention made the situation feel even more significant. Joe Louis, however, seemed determined to maintain control of the moment. He shrugged and spoke again. "Look, Steven," he said, trying to sound casual but clearly irritated by the lack of reaction. "We're all fighters here. People want to see proof, not just reputation." Some members of the crowd nodded, while others seemed uncomfortable. The gathering was supposed to celebrate martial arts unity, not create rivalry. Situations like this often reveal something important about human nature. When someone is challenged publicly, ego usually pushes them to defend themselves immediately. Walking away can feel like weakness, especially in front of peers. But discipline sometimes means choosing a different path. Seagal slowly scanned the room again. He noticed the young students watching nervously, the trainers whispering, and the fans recording every second. He also noticed how quickly excitement had turned into tension. His expression softened slightly. In moments like these, experienced martial artists understand that every action teaches something. A public confrontation doesn't just affect the people involved, it influences everyone watching. Joe Louis misread the silence as hesitation. "Come on," Louis pressed. "Don't tell me Hollywood made you forget how this works." A few people laughed awkwardly, but the reaction wasn't as strong as before. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The crowd now seemed curious rather than eager for conflict. Chuck Norris, still silent, gave a small nod as if recognizing that Seagal was carefully choosing his response. A trainer near the edge of the crowd whispered, "He's not angry. He's thinking." And that was exactly what was happening. Seagal understood that if he reacted emotionally, the situation could easily escalate into a physical altercation, something that would overshadow the entire event. But if he handled it differently, the moment could become something else entirely. A lesson. Meanwhile, Joe Louis continued standing confidently, but even he seemed unsure why the confrontation wasn't escalating the way he expected. Some spectators began murmuring again. Maybe Seagal doesn't need to prove anything. Or maybe he's about to. The tension returned, but this time it felt different. Instead of waiting for a fight, people were waiting for an answer. And then Seagal finally spoke. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just calmly. His voice was steady enough that the crowd leaned in to hear. "You know," he began, looking not just at Louis but at everyone around them, "martial arts aren't about showing who's stronger in public." The crowd went quiet again. Louis raised an eyebrow, unsure where this was going. Seagal continued, his tone calm but firm. "They're about discipline, control, respect." The words seemed to slow the entire moment down. Even those recording lowered their phones slightly, listening now rather than waiting for action. Chuck Norris watched carefully, a faint smile forming as he sensed the confrontation taking an unexpected direction. Lewis opened his mouth as if to respond, but something about the calm confidence in Seagal's voice stopped him. For the first time since the confrontation began, Joe Louis didn't have an immediate comeback. And everyone in the hall could feel it. The turning point had arrived. But what Seagal was about to do next would surprise them even more, and completely change the atmosphere of the entire event. The crowd stood in silence after Steven Seagal's calm words about discipline and respect. For a moment, the tension that had filled the hall seemed to hang in the air, waiting for what would happen next. Joe Louis shifted slightly, clearly unsure how to respond. He had expected a challenge, maybe even a confrontation. Instead, Seagal's composed tone had redirected the entire situation. The energy in the room no longer felt aggressive, it felt focused. Still, Louis wasn't ready to let the moment go. "Respect," he replied, forcing a small laugh. "Respect is earned when skills are tested." A few spectators nodded, but many now seemed more interested in hearing what Seagal would say next. The atmosphere had changed from confrontation to curiosity. Seagal slowly stepped forward, not aggressively but with quiet confidence. His movement alone drew everyone's attention. Phones remained raised, but now people were recording not for drama, but for something they felt might become memorable for a different reason. He looked at Louis calmly. "You're right," Seagal said. "Skills matter. But martial arts aren't just about defeating someone. They're about controlling situations so no one has to get hurt." His words carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they were delivered with certainty. The younger fighters watching seemed especially attentive, absorbing every moment. Situations like this often tempt people to prove themselves through force. Pride pushes individuals to show dominance, especially when surrounded by peers. But true mastery often appears when someone can end conflict without violence. Louis crossed his arms, still skeptical. "So what?" he replied. "You're going to give a speech now?" A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd, but the tone lacked earlier mockery. The crowd now sensed Seagal was about to demonstrate something meaningful. Instead of responding verbally, Seagal glanced around the circle. "May I?" he asked calmly, addressing the crowd and gesturing toward an open space nearby. People instinctively stepped back, creating room. Chuck Norris moved slightly to the side, watching carefully with the quiet curiosity of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen. Seagal then turned back to Louis. "No fight," he clarified. "Just a demonstration." Louis hesitated, clearly unsure whether participating would help or hurt his position. But with the entire room watching, backing down felt impossible. "Fine," Louis said. "Let's see it." The crowd leaned forward as both men stepped into the open space. Seagal's posture remained relaxed. He didn't raise his fists or prepare to strike. Instead, he motioned politely for Louis to try grabbing him. "Just grab my wrist," Seagal said calmly. Louis smirked, thinking the demonstration would be simple. He reached forward confidently, gripping Seagal's wrist firmly. What happened next was so subtle that many almost missed it. In one smooth, controlled motion, Seagal shifted his balance and rotated slightly. There was no sudden force, no aggression. Yet somehow, Louis found his own movement redirected. Within seconds, he lost balance and was guided downward, his arm controlled but not harmed. Seagal held the position briefly, showing complete control without causing pain, then gently released him. The entire movement had taken only a moment. A stunned silence filled the hall. Louis quickly stood up, clearly surprised. He wasn't injured, but his expression showed genuine confusion about how effortlessly the technique had worked. The crowd erupted in murmurs. "Did you see that? He barely moved. That was clean." Chuck Norris nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the simplicity and control of the demonstration. Seagal stepped back, giving Louis space and showing no sign of triumph. He didn't celebrate or seek applause. Instead, he simply stood calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Moments like this reveal something deeper about martial arts. Real mastery isn't loud or flashy. It's efficient, controlled, and focused on safety rather than destruction. Louis rubbed his wrist slightly, trying to regain composure. The earlier confidence in his posture was gone, replaced by quiet realization. Seagal addressed the crowd again. "Martial arts are meant to protect," he said calmly. "Not to humiliate." The room fell silent again, absorbing the message. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Joe Louis had nothing to say. The challenge that started as public mockery had turned into a lesson in humility, delivered without anger, without violence, and without ego. But the reaction from the crowd that followed would make the moment even more unforgettable. For a moment after the demonstration, the hall remained completely silent. It was the kind of silence that follows something unexpected, when people need a few seconds to fully process what they just witnessed. Joe Louis stood still, clearly trying to understand how the situation had shifted so quickly. Just minutes earlier, he had controlled the conversation, confidently mocking Steven Seagal in front of fighters, fans, and fellow legends. Now, the energy of the room had completely changed. Then, slowly, applause began. At first, it came from a small group near the back. Then more people joined. Within seconds, the entire crowd erupted into loud applause and cheers. Not because of a fight or humiliation, but because they had witnessed control, discipline, and professionalism in action. Phones were still raised, capturing every reaction. Some spectators were already replaying the footage, amazed at how effortlessly Seagal had handled the challenge. Chuck Norris smiled and shook his head slightly, clearly impressed. He stepped forward and lightly patted Seagal on the shoulder, a gesture of respect between martial artists who understood exactly what had just happened. "That," someone in the crowd whispered, "is real mastery." Joe Louis forced a small nod, trying to recover his composure. He wasn't hurt, but his pride had clearly taken a hit. The demonstration had been clean and respectful, yet it left no doubt about Seagal's skill. What surprised many people even more was Seagal's reaction. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't smile proudly. He didn't look at Louis with victory in his eyes. Instead, he simply bowed his head slightly and stepped back, as if the entire moment had been nothing more than a normal training exchange. Situations like this often tempt people to celebrate publicly. After being mocked, many would have taken the opportunity to embarrass their challenger. But Seagal chose a different path. He turned toward the crowd and spoke calmly. "We're all here because we love martial arts," he said. "There's no need to compete outside the ring. Respect is what keeps this community strong." His words settled over the room, and the applause slowly faded into thoughtful silence again. Fighters who had spent years competing nodded in agreement. Trainers whispered approval to their students. Even Joe Louis seemed to recognize the lesson. He exhaled slowly and gave Seagal a respectful nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Moments like this remind people that martial arts are more than physical strength. They are about discipline, humility, and understanding when not to fight. Meanwhile, several attendees were already posting clips online. Social media notifications buzzed as videos began spreading almost instantly. The confrontation that nearly became a fight had instead turned into something much more meaningful. Before we move to what happened afterward, think about this situation. Who impressed you more in this moment? The challenger who spoke boldly, or the calm master who handled the situation without anger? Share your opinion in the comments. Because everyone watching that day seemed to learn something important. Chuck Norris then stepped closer, smiling slightly as he looked between both men. "Well," Norris joked lightly, "I guess we all got a lesson today." The crowd laughed, breaking the last of the tension. Joe Louis finally extended his hand toward Seagal. There was hesitation in the motion, but also respect. Seagal shook his hand calmly, ending the confrontation completely. Spectators relaxed, conversations slowly resumed, and the event atmosphere returned, but the story of what had just happened would stay with everyone present. People gathered in small groups, discussing the demonstration and how calmly everything had unfolded. Some young fighters replayed the footage repeatedly, studying the movement. Others talked about how easily things could have gone wrong if ego had taken control. Seagal quietly moved away from the center of attention, greeting attendees again as if nothing unusual had happened. That humility impressed people even more than the technique itself. Yet none of them realized that within hours, the footage would spread across the internet, reaching millions of viewers around the world. And the consequences of that viral moment would soon reach far beyond that martial arts hall. By the time the martial arts event ended that evening, Most attendees had already shared the footage online. Clips of the confrontation, Joe Louis mocking Steven Seagal, the tense standoff, and the calm demonstration that followed, were spreading rapidly across social media platforms. Within hours, martial arts forums, sports pages, and fan communities were discussing the incident. Different versions of the video appeared online, recorded from multiple angles. Each clip captured the same surprising outcome, a public challenge that ended not in violence, but in discipline and respect. By the next morning, the story had gone viral. Millions of viewers watched the footage, many commenting on how rare it was to see a confrontation handled so calmly. Some viewers admitted they expected a fight. Others praised Seagal for choosing control instead of aggression. Debates quickly followed. Supporters of different martial art styles argued online, discussing whether technique or physical power mattered more. But beyond the technical discussions, one message appeared again and again in comment sections. Respect matters more than ego. Meanwhile, back at the event location, those who witnessed the moment firsthand still talked about it. Fighters replayed the situation in their minds, realizing how easily it could have gone differently. One aggressive move. One angry response. One loss of control, and the story might have ended with chaos instead of applause. Instead, it became a lesson. Joe Louis also felt the impact. Interviews later suggested he didn't expect the situation to escalate publicly. Some reports claimed he respected Seagal's calm reaction afterward, acknowledging that things had gotten carried away in the moment. Situations like this remind people how quickly pride can create unnecessary conflict. Even experienced professionals sometimes get caught in public challenges, especially when cameras and audiences are involved. But what truly impressed viewers worldwide was Seagal's behavior after the demonstration. He didn't give interviews attacking Louis. He didn't boast online or replay the moment to gain attention. He simply moved on. Friends later mentioned that Seagal considered the incident just another example of how martial arts should guide behavior, even outside training halls. Clips continued circulating for weeks, inspiring discussions among students and instructors. Many martial arts schools even used the footage as an example during classes, teaching students that discipline matters as much as physical skill. Parents shared the video with their children, emphasizing how calm behavior can defuse conflict. Trainers used it to show that real mastery isn't about humiliating opponents, but about maintaining control. And perhaps the biggest lesson was simple. Sometimes the strongest move is the one that prevents a fight. Years later, people who attended the event would still remember the atmosphere in the hall, the tension, the silence, and then the realization that they had witnessed something meaningful. Because moments like that stay with people. They remind us that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's quiet confidence. Sometimes, it's patience. Sometimes, it's the decision to teach rather than attack. And in a world where conflicts often escalate quickly, stories like this stand out. Before we end, think about this. How often do we see situations in everyday life where anger takes over instead of calm thinking? How many arguments could end peacefully if someone chose discipline over ego? That day, Steven Seagal didn't just handle a challenge. He showed everyone watching that martial arts, at their core, are about self-control and respect. And now we want to hear from you. Do you believe true strength comes from power, or from staying calm under pressure? Tell us your opinion in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and believe no one should be judged by appearance or ego, type respect in the comments and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. Because sometimes, the greatest victories happen without a single punch thrown.